There were executives who were like, I know that you really care about this on a personal level, and I want to help, and there's only so much I can do. And then I would wait. And then, like, they would get tapped to help with their daughter's third grade science project. And their third grader would be like, what are you doing about climate change? And all of a sudden, they'd have this moment of like, what am I doing?
What if the key to transformation lies in shifting your perspective? Hi, I'm Dr. Payal Beri. Welcome to Reframing Perspectives. Every conversation here is about one thing: how empathy changes the way we lead, connect, and create impact. Each episode, we get to explore deep, authentic conversations designed to expand your mindset. Whether you're looking to transform your leadership, deepen your relationships within your circle, your community, and friends, or gain clarity in your own personal growth, each episode will inspire you to see things differently and take action. If you're ready to challenge your thinking and embrace transformation, you're in the right place. Let's dive in. Today's episode, I get to talk to Liz Best. She is one of a kind, absolutely transformational. And this episode is definitely for any of you who does work in the social impact sector, sustainability sector. Honestly, it's for anyone who really cares about driving impact. Liz gets into the behind the scenes of it, like what it really takes to work in spaces where things are affected by policy, things are affected by bureaucracy, egos are driving things. She talks about just her experience in the challenges in corporate sustainability and the importance of waiting for those like right moments to push your initiatives forward. How do you overcome apathy? She's just absolutely phenomenal. And the work that she's really transcended and transformed as a sustainability strategist, she's over the last 4.5 years specifically, she's worked with leaders across Adobe, PwC, and nonprofit organizations to really change the trajectory of impact. And now she's coaching women. So thought provoking. And I think it gives a really great insight to people who don't really understand what it takes to work in these type of fields and what it takes on an emotional toll, a mental toll, and how the power of community can make a massive difference for you. Liz is phenomenal, and I can't wait for you to hear this conversation. Hi, Liz.
Hi, Pyle. I'm so excited to be here.
I'm literally sitting on the ground and getting so in like just internal alignment for this conversation because I know that you just have so much to give. And anyone who's going to be listening to this is just going to be so like just taken by what you have to say. So I had to get comfortable myself. So I'm so excited. Thank you so much for being here. I just think that the work and everything that you have done has just been so impactful, and not just from the fact that you work in impact, but just even the work that you do now. And what I want to do before, we're going to go into so many different spaces, but what I really hope for everyone to really understand is like, the work that you've done in ESG and in public policy and, in all of these climate sustainability, everything that you've done, there's this idea that, oh my gosh, this work is so sexy and cool. And like you're making a change and like how rewarding it is. And, we see it on the news of like this impact has happened. And you see all these like powerhouse people talking about it, right? But we don't see all the work that goes on behind the scenes. The fact that that thing that got passed actually took 20, 30 years to do it. The day to day is actually a lot more mundane than what you would think it to be. And I'd just love for you to share a little bit about that your earlier journey and what it was like that, when you were even like, oh my gosh, when you heard that person speak and you're like, that's what I want to do. But then you get into it and you realize the work you're doing versus like the day to day of it and just the emotional toll that it takes on people who are doing impact work.
Oh my goodness. Well, first of all, thank you for that generous introduction. I felt that so deeply. And I also love this question. I like hate this question because like, oh, why is it so I think it can cost so much to do the work that's on our hearts. It can feel so existential. And I know I get to spend my days surrounded by change agents and the real life humans who are birthing the new. And they inspire me so much. And we feel our work on so many levels. It just, I think, hits differently when like what you're working on is in the headlines. It's in literally the air we breathe. We're in wildfire season right now in California. It's on the news. It's like in our hearts, it's in our social media feeds. It's like it's everywhere, which is cool, right? And sexy. And it also can feel like a lot. And so I guess to give a little bit of context, so I actually did have that total moment of seeing Hannah Jones from Nike, who was at the time like one of the, I'd say like early leaders in the corporate social responsibility, as we called it then, space. I heard her speak, and she talked about how she was in any given week navigating supply chain human rights challenges or briefing her executives on climate science or convening other industry leaders to talk about different topics related to sustainability and human rights, and just the variety and the impact of that work. I was like, oh my goodness, what a cool job. I want to do that. And this was back in 2010. And there were not very many jobs doing that work full time. And a lot of the advice that I got after like a very frustrating internship search, a lot of people were like, go to an organization, like get a job. I had to get a job to support myself. I was looking at the time for an internship while I was in grad school. And they were like, in almost any function, like ideally a function that's close to this work, and see how you can get involved, because so many people I knew who were doing the work had basically volunteered themselves into that job. And many of them had done that work unpaid as not part of their formal job description for some period of time before it became their job. And I knew it was what I wanted to do. And so I was like, okay, I am in it for the long haul. I was very lucky in that I landed an internship at a tech company in San Diego, in the government affairs department that was very close. I was hired to work on climate policy and privacy public policy. So it wasn't explicitly corporate sustainability, but it very much touched it. And I didn't know how I would feel about working at a company going in. Part of me thought I would love it, and part of me was like, I'm not going to work for a multinational corporation as like an international affairs global studies student. But I just fell in love with the potential impact of the technology, which was in the hands of literally billions with a B of people around the planet. And I was working with like some of the smartest people I had ever met, and it was so cool. I loved it. And I was there this summer. I got asked to extend to the school year and be brought on full time when I graduated, which was like just such a relief on so many levels. I was like, really felt as though I'd won the golden ticket. I had not had job security like since finishing college. I'd been working since I was 15. I left journalism because I needed health insurance. And so
Yeah.
to have this corporate gig, doing work I loved on a team I loved with people I respected was just such a dream. And then I ended up being there for 6 years, and I spent those 6 years doing what I sometimes compared to like trying to turn the Titanic, and sometimes described as like trying to push a boulder up a hill. Um, but I was basically part of like a tiny team that I was like for many years not even officially a part of, trying to get at different moments 7, 14, 20 plus thousand person company to do things differently, which is such a huge task. And also when you're in your early 20s, like I was so idealistic.
What you're talking about, the fact that like even if you think back to 2010, that this was still something that was still relatively new in the corporate space, right? But I remember in the 90s being a kid and hearing on the news that the scientists are saying that if we don't do things by 2030, this is what's going to happen. But in the 90s, 2030 literally felt like, oh, you're talking about the Jetsons, like it just felt like so futuristic. And that's the thing, right? Like I feel like humans are, or just the way we are, we're reactive and we're not thinking about that long term because in this moment, like the urgency isn't felt. But scientists and researchers and people who are literally trying to save the planet in some form in a way is competing against corporate priorities because corporate priorities is to be able to do things at bottom line and streamline everything. I remember like when Lean Six Sigma became everything, right? And we think about like organizations, right? With our phones, for example, or with anything, it requires people are not even talking about how much water AI actually requires to generate, right? And it takes up a lot of water consumption. Organizations are always looking at like, what is the cost value versus this? And so if we look at what's happening in Congo with like coal mining and for the metals to make our phones and to make everything. So, anyways, with all that being said, is just that it's so interesting to me that even in 2010 to now, it's like it's always still feels so contentious to talk about this. What would you say that when there's a lot of people who are just don't care and people who are just like, listen, I'm just trying to live my life and I've got other things to worry about, like what are my kids doing in school? Like I've got so much on my plate. I don't have time to think about this. Or sometimes I tell, some of my friends who are not in the space, they'll often talk about, like, I'll say, there's a lot of people who have opinions about things without having lived experiences. And I've had a couple of people say, well, actually, I don't have any opinions. Like, is it bad that I just don't care? Like, what is your thoughts about that? Just this consistent uphill battle. And it feels like it's actually going backwards versus forward. We're not progressing.
Yeah, I mean, I think whether we're progressing or not sort of depends on like what data you're looking at. Because I
Yeah.
see bright spots almost every day, and I also like read the news. But I mean, the apathy is real, and
Yeah.
unfortunately, at least in my experience, the apathy in particular in like middle management is real. I mean, I remember sitting in a meeting with a very senior executive who said out loud in the meeting, like, I'm not convinced that too much carbon is a bad thing. And what do you do with that?
Yeah. What do
So,
you do?
on my more resourced days and more resilient days, I mean, I really do think that so much of my work in my in-house life and roles, and actually so much of my work as a consultant later and even as a coach, like was waiting for the right moment and like being prepared. There were so many times in the course of my work as a change agent when it would be so frustrating because me and my team had done so much work to make the case for something that needed to happen. That was so clearly the right thing to do from a business perspective, from a stakeholder perspective, from an employee perspective. I could go on and on, and got told no. And then we would wait. And inevitably, there would be some sort of crisis where an executive asked a question, a board member asked a question, an investor asked a question, someone asked a question and was heard. And all of a sudden, everyone was like, oh my gosh, what are we supposed to do about that thing? And then my team and I would be like, well, actually, we put together a presentation on exactly what to do with this thing 7 months ago. Here's the plan. And then we would be able to move it forward. Or there were executives who were like, I know that you really care about this on a personal level, and I am being held accountable for X, Y, and Z, just as you're describing. And like, I want to help, and there's only so much I can do. And then I would wait. And then, like, they would get tapped to help with their daughter's third grade science project. And their third grader would be like, what are you doing about climate change? And all of a sudden, they'd have this moment of like, what am I doing? And I really do think that there are so many more people in the world right now who want good things than there are people who want like bad things or
Yeah.
who are apathetic. And so I do think a lot of the work of those of us who work in the impact space in some capacity as change agents or activators, as my friend Anna Adlard calls us, a lot of it's waiting for the moment when you can make an impact. I think a lot of it's being patient and prepared. And then a lot of it too, I think, is seeing how you can be a guide toward what's possible, because I think what often makes this work Especially challenging is that we know what the status quo looks like. We know how things have been, but we haven't seen what's possible. And we don't have a shared vision of a future that works for all of us and a thriving planet where everyone is taken care of, where everyone has access to opportunity. We haven't seen it. And it can be really hard to work towards something that we haven't seen.
Yeah. It's so abstract and people struggle with change. And so it's comfortable to just, we know it's working, but it's only working for a certain group or certain individuals. When you were talking, all I was thinking about is like, obviously decisions get made based off of data and science and all this stuff, but there's so much is that emotional component. The fact that this senior leader's third grader can turn on the light bulb, how can impact drivers do a better job of connecting it on a much more simpler level so that people do see that, oh, this does affect me right now? How can they connect those dots? Because I think it's so easy for us when we're in that space that it's like we're just preaching to the choir and we know the language, we know the stats and everything, but how do we share it in a way that someone has those light bulb moments?
I love that question. And I will actually say, too, this feels like weirdly self promotional, but I had a conversation with Freya Williams, who's a brilliant thinker on this topic, on my podcast, the Women Changing the World podcast, about how we make climate action cool, among other things. So I'll share a couple ideas. And I also would say, like, these are from her brilliance and my observations, but definitely check that out if you want more on this topic. I mean, I think there's two things that immediately come to mind. One, how do we make doing the right thing cool? Like, how do we make it sexy? How do we make it irresistible? How do we make it easy? I think the ease in particular is like a huge, huge, huge part of this. Like, there's so many reasons. I'm reminded all the time. This is such a random example, but bear with me. I'm reminded all the time that there was an experiment that someone did at like a football stadium to try to get people to recycle. And what they found was the most impactful way of driving up recycling at football games was labeling the recycling cans with like the home team or the away team. And that's what made people recycle, like dramatically more.
That's amazing. Yeah.
And it's like people weren't recycling because they cared about recycling. They were recycling because they were like, I want my team to win.
Yeah. You almost like attach it back to what matters to them.
Totally. So I think with like so much of this, it's like, yeah, and this is true for internal influencing with like colleagues and peers, is like figuring out what's important to someone and what their incentives are, and then seeing how you can align those things is like a huge part of this. And I think related to that, the second thing I was going to mention is like there are certain things that really resonate with most people, at least most people in the United States where we're talking right now. There are values that we hold, like not quite universally, but that many of us hold in this country. Things like freedom is a great example. I think we've, in some cases, done ourselves a disservice, and I'm totally guilty of this, in how we frame and talk about these issues because we're not using language that resonates with everyone. The example Freya gave was around gay rights in this country and specifically marriage. And when you talk about it in the context of freedom to choose, freedom to decide who you want to marry, if you want to marry, what that looks like, people are on board. And so I think a lot of it also is like it's both knowing what motivates people and seeing how we can make doing the thing that's better for most of us or all of us feel like the right or the obvious thing, aligning it with someone's incentives and priorities, making it easy, and talking about it in a way that feels aligned with their values.
Yeah, that makes so much sense, right? Like so much of what we do, our ingrained behavior, anything, our opinions, our judgment, everything comes from what we value. And if we can find that as the bridge to bring us together, I think that one thing that has been challenging and I hope that, my hope is that we kind of start moving backwards in this sense, is that we're able to have conversations in a way that helps each other understand our perspectives, and we get more curious and ask of, well, okay, I get that you care so much about this, but help me understand why, versus this. What I notice is, and I don't know if you've picked up on this or seen this for yourself, and I find this really fascinating actually, is that when someone is very passionate about a topic or something that they're really driven towards, right? Then people tend to dismiss them, being like, oh, well, they always care about this. So whatever, instead of looking at it as, this person cares really deeply about this issue. I need to understand what they know. But we're so quick to dismiss the ones who are actually like talking about it. What do you think that's about?
It's such a good question, and I don't know the answer. I mean, I do think that like other people are a mirror, and typically when we're like triggered by or dismissive of something or someone, it's because they're bringing up something that we don't like about
Yeah,
ourselves.
right.
And I also do find that that's often the case. Like, I think we also, as humans, like, can't help but pay attention to the things that surprise us.
Yeah,
So I think when messages come in unlikely formats from unlikely sources, we pay attention.
that's true.
Partially, probably as like a survival mechanism, to be honest.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's like, I think we also just like take what we know as like we take it for granted, right? So then if there's someone who's standing up that normally wouldn't, we're like, okay, maybe I need to pay attention to that. So while you were working and in this space, obviously it was like we talk about burnout, right? Because you're working on something that is an uphill battle. It is, I always kind of talk about, even when I was in the mental health space and working as an active therapist, like there were just so many moments where it felt like Mount Everest, and the rewards aren't like, you're not passing policy daily, you're not like, there's a lot that goes into it. And to what your point was, it's like you had something 7 months ago that could have prevented that crisis moment from happening, but it took someone else to say something for them. And again, right, it goes back to like their own reputation, their own image. And now it's like, oh crap, like I've got to show up for this. So there's a lot of burnout that happens. And I know that, like, obviously now you've really shifted into supporting women who are in that space, who are doing the impact work, and how to help them being able to do it in a way that's sustainable for them, continue to support that. But what is it? I want listeners to understand like the emotional bandwidth that it takes to do this work.
Totally. And when you say that, I mean, I could take this in so many directions. Do you mean the emotional bandwidth for change agent work, the emotional
Yes.
bandwidth of the work that I do now?
So I want to start with the change agent and your experience of that. And of course, like we'll move it into why you're doing the work you're doing now.
Totally. Perfect. Well, so when I think about burnout, the first two people I think about are the Nagoski sisters, Emily and Amelia Nagoski, who talk about what causes burnout. And there's a lot of things, spoiler. But one of the things that really stuck with me from their book called Burnout is that a lot of why we experience burnout is that we are not completing the stress cycle. Like as humans, our bodies have a response to stress that serves us when, like, for example, a lion is chasing us
Right.
and it is like fight, flight, freeze. Those are some options. And depending on like your wiring, you may be more inclined to one of those than the other. But in the situation where you get an email that kind of sucks, or you get told no, or you work really hard to get promoted and doesn't happen, or a presentation doesn't go well. I mean, I could go on and on and on. That's creating stress in your body, like physiologically. And if we're not making the time to complete the stress cycle the way that the stress cycle would get completed if we were running for our lives from a lion and working through those hormones in our body, then we're just carrying it around. We're just carrying it around and we're carrying more and more and more of it around. And that is what often for many of us like leads to burnout is that we are not processing, synthesizing feeling the feelings in many cases that come with doing this work, and it takes a toll eventually. And so I think a huge part of like burnout for impact and sustainability professionals in particular is that there's so many things that can create stress. Like there's the aspects of like a job that creates stress. There's aspects of like the world that creates stress. And if we aren't in relationship with ourselves and finding consistent outlets that work for us, because it's certainly not a one size fits all, but there are definitely some things that I think work for most people, like exercise, time in nature, a really good hug, um, being near a body of water, being in water. If we're not making time to do those things, then we're not like releasing that valve. And if we think about it like steam in a kettle, it's like it's all just like boiling,
Yeah.
building, and we need to release it in some way. And so I think when I think about personal sustainability, both for founders and for in-house leaders, it's like how are we consistently like letting the steam out of the kettle in a way that like lets us get back on the stove.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think obviously burnout is something that's felt by pretty much anyone who's in the workforce or even outside of it, right? There's some level of that, but there's different indicators for depending on what you're in the space you're in. And I know, obviously you feel very strongly about now supporting women who are doing a lot of this work. What have you found in terms of when you've approached it now from this feminine energy and from helping, these impact drivers to really hone in on themselves first? What have you seen just as a theme across the collective that they are getting more done or their, impact is driving further? Or is it more that they're just a little bit less detached and not feeling like all of the burden of the world falls on their shoulders?
Yeah, I think there's a few things that I am observing. One, I think a huge part of what makes this work feel hard can be the feeling of loneliness that
Mhm.
comes with doing the work. When you are a small team in a big organization, even if your teammates are your team, it may not feel like your colleagues from other departments are your team when like your job is to try to convince them to do things differently. And even for people with teams, like if you're the head of the team, which many of my clients are, you may not have people at your level or above you who you can turn to for problem solving or like brainstorming. And that can feel really lonely too, especially when so much of what we're doing has never been done before. We don't have jobs where it's like, here's the playbook, go.
Right.
So I think like community and connection and like having real relationships with other people who make you feel less alone in this and being able to like resource yourself and put yourself in places where you can see all the other people who are also working toward this shared vision that we're going to do things like address the climate crisis, that can be really, really helpful. I think the two other things that come to mind are one, really taking the time to build a new relationship with our ambition. A lot of the conversations I've been having in the past few weeks have been about this idea of redefining our ambition, reimagining our ambition, which is actually one of the values of the community that I lead. I just think for so many people, especially women in this space, in this work, we are recognizing the ways in which what we have been taught about success or taught about ambition or seen modeled, it doesn't work for us. It doesn't work for where we're at in our lives. It doesn't take into account the other hats we wear, whether that's as like a caregiver or a mother or an aunt or living with chronic illness. Like there's so many things that can impact the relationship we have or want to have with our work. And seeing how people are doing some like really deep values work and exploration of what is important to them in this work and in the world and in their lives, and really thinking about like what it means to be ambitious or successful in our own terms, I think is also can be hugely transformational. And I think doing that work in community can also be really powerful because it's countercultural and that can feel lonely too. And so then how do we take like the loneliness factor out of that? I think seeing other people who are doing it alongside us can be really powerful. And the last thing that I'll name is that I think a huge part of it too is recognizing that like these systems were not built for many of us to thrive. And when I think about some of the most resonant things that people have shared with me from like our programs over the past 5 years and the work that we've gotten to do, I'm like, I just keep being brought back to a conversation I had with another founder whose sustainability is like core to their business, who was sharing that like they were recognizing that like there are structural things that are preventing them from reaching certain goals or certain things that they wanted for themselves and their business. And that like they get to decide if they want to keep hitting their head against the wall, trying to change the system, like this particular system, or pick a different challenge. And I think this is where a lot of the conversations I've been having with my clients who work in corporate in particular lately, like this is like really top of mind, I think, for a lot of smart people. Like capitalism is flawed. There, I said it.
Yeah. And that's okay, right? Like it's okay to recognize that like we're not saying it's bad, we're not saying it's great. Like it's just like it's flawed just like everything else because it's guess what? It's made by humans who are also flawed.
Totally. And I think it's like this question that I've been sitting with. I was recently in like this really beautiful cohort around the topic of reimagining leadership, led by my friend, facilitator Rebecca McGee of Sister Seasons. And I think there's this interesting question when it comes to systems change of whether, like, someone brought up a beautiful analogy around like this question of like, in many cases, a body knows how to self-regulate, like a body knows how to heal itself. And sometimes in a body, things get so out of whack that you need to like have a dramatic intervention to assist the healing process. And I think when I look at the systems that we're operating in, on the one hand, if I think of the collective as a body, I think we have so much intelligence, and every single person and component of the system has that intelligence. And how can we unlock that collective intelligence to self-heal with it? And maybe there's no intervention needed. But then there's also the question of like, or are we so out of whack that something really dramatic needs to happen in order,
Probably.
yeah, in order to recalibrate, but then also whose job is it to decide?
Yeah. You know, I was thinking about this as there's all this excitement behind progression of technology, right? So if we look at technology and we look at where things have been from the 1920s, 30s, like everything, right? Like, I mean, trains were the biggest revolutionary technology that changed the entire landscape of how this country and the world essentially operated and the ships and all of that stuff, right? Then we came into the era of computers and, we see the digital, and now we're in this revolution of AI and what that's doing, right? And there's all this excitement about look at the progression, look at how much we've been able to do because of technology, look at what we've been able to do with that. And so there's this acceptance about technology and what technology can do to get us to this next place. But it's interesting that there's this really hard clenching of when it comes to human capital and our functionality. Because it's like, well, this is just, this is what works. This is what's happened. This is what we've done. And if we look at it, right, like we had prior to the Industrial Revolution, we had, farmers, agricultural, you had all this stuff, and then you moved into Industrial Revolution. But even at that time, like it was a lot of blue collar work, right? You're working factories. And, I think it's been over 100 years. And that's when Ford actually changed the work days from 6 or 7 days a week to 5 days a week. So we haven't gone past that. It's been over 100 years and we haven't shifted culture, right? Or like the way labor works. And I find it really interesting that we can be so pro technology and external things. But when it comes to the functionality of us, then it's this idea that things have to stay the way they were. Even if you look at like conversations in our country that are happening, right? And there's always this focus on, well, the forefathers, wrote the Constitution in this way. It's like, well, yeah, if you also read it, they said that this is an ever changing, ever, growing paper. Like it's, and things that existed and that were acceptable 250, 300 years ago are not going to work in the age of technology, right? Like we're living in a completely different time zone. Like when you were talking, like that really stuck out to me is that paradigm of the system that we're in. It's like we're so willing to accept other systems changing, but we're so unwilling to accept what's good for us as society.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting, right? Because I actually think in a lot of ways, the pandemic did more to accelerate like a reimagining of work and the role of work in our lives than like anything certainly I've seen in my lifetime.
So was that the reaction that you were just mentioning about something drastic has to happen in order for us to change? Like, was the pandemic that for us?
I don't know because honestly, I still don't think I think we still have so far to go. I mean, I remember learning about like the concept of artificial intelligence and thinking about like the promise of technology from a like productivity perspective back in college, like more than 15 years ago. And this is me at like 18, 19, being like, why would anyone work 40 hours a week
Yeah.
when we like can do all of this with machines, hopefully run on solar and renewable energy? Then like what a world. Like I thought at that time, like so cute and naive, but I fully believed that by the time I was like a working adult in the middle of my career, that there's like no reason why people would work more than 20 hours a week. Like why would you work more than 20 hours a week? And yet here we are, and there's this huge disparity between the people who have full-time jobs, many of whom are working like way more than 40 hours a week, which is like a
40 hours is like this minimum, and if you work only 40 hours, you're shamed for it.
totally, and it's a totally made up construct. It's set from over 100 years ago. And so it's wild to me that we like have not further recalibrated. And I do wonder, like, I certainly hope I don't wish another like huge event or shock to the system on us, but I honestly don't know. It's so hard to tell. I think what I know, I know that Malcolm Gladwell is actually, I think, coming out with a book this fall on like why tipping points aren't real. So so I'll use the phrase tipping point, but I'm like, is that the right thing? I don't know. But it's like it's so hard to know what would be the catalyst for this to change in a meaningful way.
Mm.
And I also still find it impossible to believe that it won't happen in our lifetime.
Yeah. I do think that, like, for example, the work that you're doing in your collective now and the work that is happening, and the fact that we know that people are moving out of corporate, or we're moving more towards a gig economy, and 52% by 2027 is expected. And I forgot which CEO or someone it was, but said that, oh, LinkedIn, the LinkedIn co-founder, former co-founder, he was saying that he expects that by 2035 that we won't actually have 9 to 5 jobs anymore. And so, that was an interesting piece that he was talking about. But I do think that there's also this, we're so critical of ourselves. And I think that, like, when everyone is just more critical of themselves, and when we collectively come together, we become collectively critical of ourselves as a human race. And so the things that you're talking about, like the shift in the way that we're working, the shift of really redefining success and values and ambition and all of those things that are happening. Like we look at what Gen Z is talking about, what they care about, right? Like these shifts are happening, but there's also this, again, quick to say it's not working before we're even allowing the iterations to shift. So it's like when we talk about solar, we talk about things that are like energy, and we're saying, oh, see, it didn't work. And it's like we haven't even given it a chance to see that it's going to work. We've got to do iterations of it, right? We're quick to being, I guess, jaded or cynical about it. And
Or to dismiss it. Yeah.
yes, completely. But I think that it really does come down to the fact of also recognizing that these challenges have existed for a long time, and these challenges are going to continue to exist. And so when you're a change maker, you're an impact driver, whether, as someone as entrepreneurs or internally, what I love about what you're doing with your collective is it is an uphill battle. It is a challenge to be in that space. But by bringing people together, it's also reminding everyone that you don't have to put all the weight on your shoulders. Because I do think that change makers typically do think that way. They are the adrenaline rush that I get from like, I'm going to change the world and I'm going to make this impact. And I get these bursts of energies where I get a lot done, but then it's like fatigue, right? And you have these moments because we care so deeply. And a lot of times then guilt comes in that I'm not doing enough, right? Or guilt of, I can't believe that these people don't even care. Like, how do they not see this, right? Frustration, anger. Like, we have a lot of like emotions that we're having to process around that. So, what I love what you're doing with the collective is you're helping them see that not only are you doing the work, but you've got your community that's doing the work. So it's okay for you to take a day off. It's okay for you to also tend to your own internal world as much as you are caring for the external world.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. I feel really seen. And I also think that like it's tough, right? Like individualism was like someone's idea, but it certainly wasn't like most of ours. And rewiring the individualism that's like been programmed into so many of us, especially those of us who live like in the United States,
Yeah.
like it takes work and it takes time and like we need to rewire those like pathways for ourselves and our nervous system, our neural pathways to like shift how we approach this stuff. And when I think the quote that keeps coming up for me, and I don't know who to attribute it to, which I'm like bothered by, but it will come to me, I'm sure, as soon as we hang up, is this idea is like, it's not your fault, but it is your responsibility.
Oh, I love that.
And I think it's like once we start to wake up to the
Mhm.
ways in which things like individualism are shaping our lives and our approach to work and so many other things, it's not our fault. It's not our fault, but it is our responsibility to make choices that feel aligned with us. And we're not all gonna like figure it out tomorrow. Like I think about Adrienne Marie Brown, who always says like small is all, or maybe she doesn't always say that, but I feel like I've read that from her in multiple places, this idea of like small is all. And so often I think we can get totally the adrenaline hit or like caught up in the big vision and the big hope of what change looks like. And I think we can forget that change is in like some quiet moments. It's also in like who we be, which I'm saying like intentionally, like how we be. And if we're going about changing the world in a way that's like driving ourselves into the ground, like that's not actually how we make sustainable change. Like
Yeah.
we are also nature. And so how do we pursue this in a way that's aligned with the seasons and the planet and that allows for rest as regeneration and allows us to keep going in the long haul because nobody wins when we burn ourselves out in this work.
Oh my gosh, Liz, I could keep talking to you forever. You just and you have such a wealth of knowledge. I want to read everything that you've just been talking. Like I noted on all these books I want to read now. Um,
I feel like I'm like, aha, I'm weirdly like a library, like a reference book today, but I will send over all the links, of course.
I love it. Yeah, and I love to share it with everybody too. So, you know, you're so like I think that, just looking at that, right? And I think that social media and technology has in some form brought us together, but it's also created more loneliness, obviously, and it's created more individualism. Like we've really, especially in the United States, we swung on this pendulum. And now I'm seeing the influence of American culture in other countries. And they're kind of who were very collective, who are starting to move more in the individualistic space. And we're now starting to see other types of crises happening there too. And so it's really interesting. Again, humans, right? We swing on this all or nothing pendulums, and we have a really hard time kind of centering ourselves on that. But I think part of that, like that quote, even of like, it's not for us to carry the blame, but it's our responsibility. It's just like, I think part of that is like carrying healing the wound internally so that we don't get so triggered or feel so exposed when we say that this isn't working. And we don't quickly go to like, well, it's not my fault. And it's like, we're not saying that it is. Yes, this happened before you were even conceived, like we get it. It's not your fault. But just like you try to better anything, you want to work out, you want to get your body healthier. You're not going to sit around and be like, well, it's what it is, right? Like you go to the gym, you work out, you take care of yourself. Like the more we learn about health, like everything. So with that, I want to ask you, like all of this that you have been doing in your work with your own internal work for yourself, your work in the space, and now nurturing and supporting these incredible, transformational, magical women in your collective. I'm curious to know, what is a reframing perspective that you're taking for yourself, something that, is new to you and you haven't necessarily thought about that perspective before. And now you're like, huh, this is something that I now am going to be working through to reframe this perspective.
Uh, I love this question, and I have two answers. The first, just with that like gorgeous introduction, I do feel like a huge part of my own work as a leader, as a coach, as a facilitator in this space, and a huge part of the work that I've just like watched transform a lot of people around me, I think as a starting point is we have to feel our feelings like before we move to action. And whether that's grief or rage or sadness or joy, um, obviously, like there's such a complex range of human emotions, but like I think sometimes before we start going to the gym, we need to like sit with our anger at ourselves for not going sooner and sit with our frustration or like with our body or with our willpower or whatever the thing or the story we're telling ourselves, whatever it may be. I know I have suffered so much from stuffing my feelings down or trying to spiritual bypass my way around them. And I find that like the more I make the time and space to metabolize what I'm feeling, the more it creates space for expansion and possibility. And so that's been just a huge shift for me. Victoria Song is someone who teaches a lot about that. Her book, Bending Reality, is really powerful, which of course I'll include in the now long list of things I have to share with you after. I think the other thing that comes up for me, which like spoiler alert, if you're listening and you may not know this news already, is I am actually on a journey to motherhood. I know it's wild. It's wild. I feel very lucky. Also, wow, so many people have so many opinions about motherhood and moms. And like,
Yeah.
it's actually been really interesting. I think I've never felt so nervous talking about anything with like fear of offending someone with my opinion as I have on this topic.
Wow.
What I think has been such a gift, and I feel so grateful for all of my own healing work and the many, many people who have supported me in getting here and staying here, is that this for me has actually been the greatest exercise of self-trust and surrender
Mm.
that I have ever experienced. It was something where I went into it with my partner after a lot of deliberation. It was something I could really see for myself or not see for myself. And it was one of those things that I felt like so few people were talking about the possibility of becoming parents from a perspective of like, if it happens, it happens. And that was really like our approach. And we're very lucky that
It
for
happened.
whatever reason in the universe, it was like it happens. And it's been really interesting to me how I knew, like, I would say not even intuitively, I knew in my head going into this that I've watched so many people suffer on this journey in direct proportion to how comfortable they were giving up control.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's if I went in and I was like, if I'm going to do this, I want to do this from a place of like, I don't have control. Like, I
Yeah.
am not gonna try to like grip. I am not gonna try to muscle. I am going to let this unfold the way it wants to unfold. And I'm going to do my best to just keep a loose grip. And it actually has felt so natural for me in this
Amazing.
journey. Thank you. It has also shown a light on all the areas of my life and work where I thought that I was doing that, and I 100% was not.
Yeah, it's amazing how these certain milestones really bring it back to yourself to, now as you're moving into this chapter, it's like a collective. It's more than just you, and I'm first of all so excited for this for you. Congratulations. And
Yeah.
I think it's also so powerful. I don't think of it as a coincidence or as a, just something that just happens. But I do think that the work that you have done and the internal understanding of yourself, right? And your openness to that. And for you to be birthing a Pisces boy, I think is going to be a very powerful. Like, I think that you having a Pisces boy is by no coincidence at all. Um, the intentionality of raising the next generation with intention, with that divine understanding of the yin and yang, of that masculine and feminine energy, and for it to be the last sign of the astrological chart. Like, there's just so much there that, again, we could probably go into a whole another hour of conversation around. But I think there's so much there that I do personally believe that the child or whoever gets placed in your life is with very deep intention of why. And after this conversation we've had, it feels even more fitting that you would have a Pisces boy.
Totally. Well, thank you so much. Yeah, I love that reflection so much. And I also I mean, I gender is 100% a social construct, and I'm
Yep.
like pretty sure that by the time this child is like in the world, they'll be like, you like this was a thing that you talked about and made a big deal about. Like I can't
Right.
believe, gosh, that's so old school, mom.
Hopefully, right? Hopefully we'll be in that space. Well, I'm excited to see you on this journey and how this is going to just transform your own work that you're continuing to do. You were a nurturer of the world, a nurturer of this community of impact drivers, and now you're going to be a nurturer of the next generation.
Yeah, totally. Thank you. And it's so funny to me, like also the humor is not lost on me that like after a lifetime, like I grew up in a household of women, all of my work is gathering and supporting women, and my house just keeps filling up with the boy spirits.
It's balancing the yin and yang.
Totally, totally, which I'm so here for.
Well, Liz, I'm so excited for you. Thank you so much for sharing your journey, with sharing just your perspective on the impact work. And obviously, I'd love for everyone to be able to find you. And I know obviously you have just your collective is just such a powerful space for people to be in. I'd love for you to share how and where they can find you, connect with you. Of course, you have your own brilliant podcast as well, but I'd love for you to
It's
share it
a
all.
great episode with you,
Yeah.
which I'll put a plug in for.
Thank you. Can add that to the whole list too.
Totally, why not? Well, thank you so much for that invitation. I'll share just like a few spots. If you want to follow along with me, Liz Best, the best places to do that are Instagram, which I'm Liz Best, or find me on LinkedIn. Just search for Liz Best. And then Girls Club Collective, we are in both of those places as well. So you can look on LinkedIn for Girls Club Collective, Instagram, we're girls_club_collective.
Regardless of how you connect with Liz Best, just connect because she is the best.
Oh
So,
my gosh, thank you so much, Pyle. The admiration is so mutual.
thank you so much, Liz. And I can't wait for everyone to just see more of you in the world.
Well, thank you.
I really hope that you enjoy this episode, and I just have one favor to ask you. If you could just make sure to hit that subscribe button, leave a rating and review, it's going to help us tremendously to make sure that we reach as many people as possible that you think should be listening to our episodes. I'll see you next week for another episode, and thank you so much for leaving that one review, that one subscription, and sharing this with your friends.